bags. Okay, gang. So in our last video, we went over a basic introduction of the adjusting process and those adjusted entries that you have to make at the end of the period right before you do the financial statements. So now in this video, we're going to dive deep into the first set of adjusted entries known as prepaid expenses. So as we said in the previous video with the introduction of adjusting process, these prepaid expenses aren't expenses. They're actually asset accounts. And how do they become asset accounts? Simply by paying for an expense in advance. So any type of expense that we have that hasn't incurred or hasn't happened yet, we can pay for them in advance. And if we choose to do that, we've created a prepaid. That's why the name says prepaid expense. And so with that being said, that gives us a future benefit. And since a future benefit is created, this belongs a part of the asset category. And so what I want to talk about in this particular video is describe how we first initialize a prepaid and how we then make the adjustment at the end of the period. So without any further ado, let's go to the board. Okay, gang, before we go into an example of a prepaid, I'd like to share with you this beautiful left-hand illustration of what should be popping on in your head when we're thinking about prepaids. So remember, a prepaid expense is actually an asset that happens whenever you pay for an expense in advance. So if you take a look at the very first illustration, when we initialize a prepaid, because in this situation, you have to first record the initial transaction of the prepaid to put it on the books. At the end of the period is where you actually make the adjustment. And so this is basically recording the prepaid on the books. And at this particular point, if you look at this seesaw or scale, however you want to categorize it, the prepaid asset or prepaid expense account, which is an asset, is full. So it's full with whatever amount that you actually pay on the expense in advance. And as we see at the bottom, the expense itself, because it was paid in advance, is empty. There's no such expense account that has been created. But as time passes, what happens to the seesaw? The asset starts to go down. Why does that prepaid asset starts to go down? Well, it's simple, gang. The asset is going down because the expense is incurring. The expense is happening. So as the asset is decreasing, the expense is actually increasing. And so this illustrates how we're going to record the actual adjustment. And so I want you to visualize this when you're thinking about prepaids. Initially, the prepaid is full, but as time goes on, that prepaid begins to get eaten up or decreased. Why? Because the expense is actually happening. So let's take a look at the transaction. So on May 1st, suppose that It's a Joke paid $12,000 in advance for 12 months rent. So first thing I want to notate, gang, is that this is May 1st, okay? This is what happens when we initialize. This is the initial transaction. Basically, we're going to put the prepaid on the books on May 1st. So what happened on May 1st? The company paid, keyword. Remember what I told you guys about the keyword paid, right? And in advance for 12 months rent. Those are all keywords. The fact that we paid in advance 12 months rent means that we have created a prepaid expense. Why? Because rent is an expense and it was paid in advance. So how are we going to initially record this prepaid asset, right? Well, again, based on our keywords, anytime you see paid in a description and a company is paid, we always credit cash. So keep that in mind. But what are we going to debit? It's easy, gang, right? We know that this is an asset that has been created. And so we are going to increase this particular asset based on our all-clear system on the debit side. So what are we going to debit? We are going to debit prepaid rent. And for how much? $12,000. So we basically paid $12,000 for 12 months rent. The reason I made that description so you could easily identify how much rent is owed per month for this expense. And obviously we know 12,000, 12 months, $1,000 per month. Okay? So we're going to record this transaction by debiting prepaid rent. And as I said before, we saw the word paid, so we're going to credit cash. Now, I'm going to post this prepaid rent in this corner to the ledger just so you can visualize what's happening. And I want you to start thinking about that seesaw. So we have $12,000 as of May 1st in the prepaid rent account. But now it's the end of the year, gang. And at the end of the year, right before we make our financial statements, we need to adjust. So we're going to make an adjustment entry. And so you know what we're going to adjust. We are going to adjust the prepaid, that particular asset we created as of May. So if you refer back to the previous illustration of the seesaw, from May through December 31st, time has passed. And what has happened to this initial asset? It has gone down. Why has this asset gone down, gang? Very easy. It's going down because rent has been happening. Rent has been incurring. So in all actuality, the asset prepaid rent is going down and rent is going up. So how do we make this adjustment? Well, we know based on the all clear system, gang, that rent is an expense. It's on the all side. So in order to increase it, we have to debit it. So we're going to debit rent expense. And since we know that the asset is going down, prepaid rent, we have to credit it. So we're almost there, but we have to get the right numbers. And this is another tip for you, gang. I've been in the game teaching accounting, chasing the bag for over 20 years. And I still use my fingers when it's time to count the months. Use your fingers. It's much easier. I know it sounds primitive, but trust me. So we first need to calculate how much of that prepaid should go down, okay? So first, let's calculate the time. From May to the end of May, from June to the end of June, from July to the end of July, from August to the end of August, from September to the end of September, from October to the end of October, from November to the end of November, and from December to the end of December. That gives me 8 months that has passed. And yes, I'm over here using my fingers. 8 months have passed. Okay, so how are we going to calculate this? Now, this is simple math, gang, but sometimes it's not. So I want to show you how to calculate it. We're going to take the total amount that we paid in advance, which is $12,000. And we're going to multiply it times the time that has passed, which is 8 months. And we're going to divide it by the total months that was prepaid, which was 12. Right? Now, it's simple math because we already know that we paid $12,000 for 12 months. So it's actually what? $1,000 per month. So we easily could have came to the correct answer, but sometimes it's not that simple. So we've correctly calculated $8,000, of which we're going to debit rent expense for, and we're going to credit prepaid rent for $8,000. This basically means that our prepaid rent account has decreased by $8,000. So how much do we have left? Well, let's post this $8,000 to the prepaid in the ledger. It was a credit for the adjustment entry, therefore we credit it on the credit side. And to calculate our ending balance, we now see that we have approximately, well, exactly $4,000 left, which equates to 4 months of prepaid rent left, gang. And so this is why it's important to make this adjustment so that our particular prepaid rent account wasn't overstated for the transaction for our particular financial statements. Understand, if we wouldn't have made this adjustment, gang, we'd have reported on the financial statements prepaid rent at $12,000, when in all actuality, our prepaid rent should have been $4,000. So that's why adjusting entries are very critical. So this summarizes a beautiful example of a prepaid expense. And as I mentioned before, gang, so far this is probably the most difficult in terms of the concepts that we've learned while we've been chasing the bags. So I strongly suggest rewatching this video. As always, gang, I appreciate your time sharing with you all as we chase the bags. And if you are learning, don't forget to like, subscribe, or share this channel with your friends so that we could all chase the bags together. As always, gang, see you soon. Bags!